There is a creature in Japan so central to its culture. Its statues stand outside thousands of businesses. It appears in ancient scrolls and in the world's most popular video games. It's a symbol of generosity and good fortune. And it's famous for one anatomical feature so bizarre, so utterly strange, that most Westerners assume it has to be a joke. It's not. In Japanese folklore, this creature's scrotum is magical. It can stretch to the size of an 8-mat tatami room. It can be used as a boat, a fishing net, a raincoat, or even a weapon. Statues of this animal, a cheerful pot-bellied trickster, proudly display this feature for all to see. The question is, why? How did a real-world animal become the subject of a myth so specific, so peculiar, that it has no parallel anywhere else on Earth? The answer is far more complex than a simple folktale. It's a story about gold, deception, and the hidden spirit of Japan itself. To understand this nation, you must first understand its most mischievous icon. You must understand the Tanuki. First, let's clear up the single biggest point of confusion. You've probably seen one and not even known it. You might have called it a raccoon, or a badger, or some kind of weird fox. It has the mask of a raccoon, the body of a small dog, and the mystique of something else entirely. In the United States, we see a raccoon and think of a clever, nocturnal pest, a trash panda. In Japan, they see the Tanuki and they see a shapeshifter, a master of illusion, a jolly sake-swilling spirit that can bring you great fortune or lead you to ruin. The animal is not a raccoon. It's not a badger. It's not even closely related. It is a canid, a member of the dog family. Its proper name is the raccoon dog, and it is a living fossil, one of the most ancient and basal canids still walking the earth. And to truly begin our journey into the myth, we have to first meet the real animal, the flesh and blood creature that inspired 1,000 years of legend. The real Tanuki, or Nycteris procyonoides, is a shy, secretive animal native to the forests and mountains of East Asia. Unlike the boisterous trickster of folklore, the actual Tanuki is remarkably quiet and unassuming. They are one of the only canids in the world to hibernate during the winter, slowing their metabolism by a staggering 25% to wait out the cold in a shared burrow. They are also one of the only canids to be truly, devotedly monogamous. A male and female pair will forage together, raise their pups together, and remain partners for life. The male is an exceptionally dedicated father, bringing food to his pregnant mate and standing guard over their young. This image of a quiet, family-oriented homebody couldn't be further from the myth of the loud, sake-guzzling bachelor, who wanders the countryside playing tricks on unsuspecting travelers. So where is the disconnect? How does a shy, monogamous dog become a magical, shape-shifting party animal? The separation begins with a simple but profound concept. In Japan, there are two Tanukis. There is the real animal, the one that sniffs through the undergrowth for berries and insects. And then there is the baked Tanuki, the monster Tanuki, or changing Tanuki. This is the supernatural creature of folklore. The two have become so intertwined over the centuries that it's often impossible to tell where the animal ends and the spirit begins. The baked Tanuki is a yokai, a class of supernatural beings from Japanese folklore that can range from mischievous ghosts to terrifying demons. And the baked Tanuki is one of the undisputed kings of the yokai world. Its powers are legendary. It can shapeshift into any object or any person. It can drum on its large round belly to create thunderous, disorienting sounds. It can conjure phantom lights, known as Tanuki-bai or Tanuki fire, to lead travelers astray in the deep woods. It can create elaborate illusions, making a pile of dead leaves appear as a pile of gold coins, or turning a humble shack into a magnificent palace. These tricks are often harmless, designed more to confuse and bewilder than to cause genuine harm. A story might tell of a monk walking home at night, only to find the moon has vanished from the sky, a classic Tanuki prank. Another might speak of a merchant who buys a beautiful new kettle, only for it to sprout a head, arms, and legs and run away laughing. This was the Tanuki, but its tricks have a darker side. Legends also speak of Tanuki that impersonate loved ones, that lure people to their doom, or that use their illusions to drive men mad. They are agents of chaos, blurring the line between reality and fantasy. But even with all these incredible powers, the shape-shifting, the illusions, the phantom noises, we always come back to that one central, unavoidable feature. The magical, expandable scrotum, known in Japanese as the kintama, or golden balls. Why this? Why, out of all the possible magical abilities, Did this one become the Tanuki's most famous trademark? The origin of this belief is one of the most fascinating rabbit holes in all of Japanese history. It's a story that begins not in a mystical forest, but in the fiery, deafening workshops of ancient Japanese metalworkers. Hundreds of years ago, goldsmiths in the city of Kanazawa developed a technique for creating gold leaf that was the envy of the nation. They discovered that gold was so incredibly malleable, they could take a tiny piece and hammer it into a vast tissue-thin sheet. And the secret to protecting this delicate gold as they hammered it? They would wrap it in a special kind of animal skin, one that was uniquely soft, yet incredibly strong and flexible. A skin that could stretch to an unbelievable degree without tearing. That skin was Tanuki scrotum. The legend began to spread. The skin from a Tanuki's testicles was so strong, it could stretch a small nugget of gold to the size of 8 tatami mats. Soon, the idea of stretching became synonymous with the Tanuki itself. The animal wasn't just associated with gold. It was seen as a creature that could stretch your money, that could expand your fortune. The golden balls became literal. And so, the Tanuki was transformed from a simple forest creature into a powerful symbol of financial luck. People began carrying pieces of Tanuki skin as good luck charms for wealth. Statues were erected. The myth was born not from magic, but from metallurgy. And this is where the story truly deepens. Because once the Tanuki became a symbol of wealth and illusion, it became the perfect metaphor for the unpredictable nature of fortune itself. Money like the Tanuki can change its shape. It can appear as one thing and be another. A pile of gold can become a pile of leaves overnight. A promise of prosperity can be a clever trick. The Tanuki embodies this duality. It holds the promise of immense fortune in its golden balls, but it's also a master of deception. It reminds you that wealth is fleeting, that appearances can be deceiving, and that the world is not always what it seems. That cheerful ceramic statue you see outside a noodle shop, with its silly hat and bottle of sake, isn't just a cute mascot. It's a complex philosophical statement. It's a warning and a promise all rolled into one. It tells you, come in, may your fortune expand like the Tanuki's pouch. But it also winks as if to say, but be careful. It's all just an illusion, isn't it? This creature represents a fundamental truth about luck, money, and reality. And its story was only just beginning. Because as Japan modernized, the Tanuki would be called upon to fight in a war unlike any other. A magical, desperate battle against the forces of the modern world itself. The enemy arrived not with swords and banners, but with blueprints and steam. It was 1868, the dawn of Japan's Meiji Restoration. After centuries of deliberate isolation, the country flung its doors open to the world, desperate to catch up. And catch up it did. In a dizzying flash, feudal Japan was gone. In its place rose a nation of telegraph wires, railways, and factories belching smoke into the sky. A new mantra echoed from the cities to the countryside: civilization and enlightenment. But this new light cast a long dark shadow over the old world. The forests, the mountains, the sacred groves, these were not seen as the homes of spirits and yokai anymore. They were resources: timber to be felled, hills to be leveled, land to be cleared for sprawling new suburbs to house the growing human population. And deep within those forests, the Tanuki watched as their world began to shrink. The creeks where they fished were diverted. The ancient trees they called home were marked with red paint. The roar of machinery grew louder each day, a constant, grinding threat that never slept. For the humans, this was progress. For the Tanuki, it was war. At first, they fought back the only way they knew how, with mischief and magic. Their primary weapon was henge, the art of transformation. A crew of loggers would arrive at a worksite to find a grove of trees had been replaced by a field of giant, menacing statues overnight. They'd return the next day, nerves rattled, to find the statues gone and the trees back in place, but rearranged in a pattern that made no sense. A surveyor deep in the woods would follow a path that led him in circles for hours, only to end up exactly where he started, his equipment mysteriously filled with sand. They became ghosts. The Tanuki were masters of illusion, and they orchestrated phantom processions, the Hayaki Yagyo or night parade of 100 demons, through construction sites. Workers would flee in terror from apparitions of faceless women, long-necked monsters, and shambling creatures from their worst nightmares. For a day, maybe two, the work would stop. But the humans always came back, more determined than ever, sometimes with a Shinto priest to purify the area. their belief in progress stronger than their fear of the supernatural. The Tanuki escalated their campaign. They turned into boulders that would roll onto newly laid tracks, only to vanish before impact. They transformed into seductive women, luring foremen away from their posts with promises of sake and company. They even tried direct sabotage, turning into tools that would break or supplies that would spoil. But it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a bucket. For every project they delayed, 10 more would spring up. The enemy wasn't a single army they could trick or frighten. It was an idea, an unstoppable force of human ambition. And this is where we have to talk about the Tanuki's most famous, and perhaps most misunderstood, secret weapon. In Japanese folklore, the Tanuki's scrotum, the kintama, is not just a part of its anatomy. It's a magical tool, a symbol of immense good fortune. The word kintama literally means golden balls, a term linked to the real-world practice of ancient metalworkers, who would wrap gold in raccoon dog skin before hammering it into thin leaf. The skin was so durable, it was said a tiny piece of gold could be hammered out to the size of 8 tatami mats. This idea became fused with the Tanuki's magical identity. Their scrotums were believed to be able to stretch to incredible sizes, a literal representation of stretching one's wealth and fortune. And in their war against the humans, this became their ultimate tool of transformation. They could stretch them out to become a boat to cross a river, a giant blanket to smother a construction site, a deceptive tarp to cover a pitfall, or even a full-sized, fully furnished illusory house to confuse developers. They could project vast, terrifying images onto them like a screen, creating illusions on a scale they couldn't manage with simple shape-shifting alone. Imagine the scene. A team of engineers proud of their new dam project, arriving one morning to find the entire valley has been replaced by the image of a colossal dragon-headed demon, its face projected onto a magical canvas the size of a football field, held aloft by a dozen straining Tanuki. It was a desperate, bizarre, and ultimately tragic form of protest, because the humans, after their initial shock, simply didn't believe it. They saw it as a trick of the light, a weather phenomenon, or mass hysteria. They would wait, and the illusion would eventually fade. The magic was powerful, but it wasn't permanent. And a bulldozer is very, very permanent. This was the heartbreaking truth the Tanuki began to face. Their magic, the very essence of their being, was failing. How do you fight an enemy who no longer believes in you? How does a ghost haunt a man who thinks ghosts are just stories for children? The world was changing its rules. The age of myth was ending, and the age of iron and concrete was beginning, and the Tanuki were being rendered obsolete. This failure fractured their society. The elders, who had lived through peaceful times, urged caution and patience. They believed that if they just hid and waited, the humans would eventually tire of their destructive frenzy. But the younger, more aggressive Tanuki saw this as cowardice. Led by a fiery chieftain named Ganta, they argued for all-out war. They wanted to stop creating illusions and start causing real harm. They proposed derailing trains, collapsing tunnels, and using their powers to directly attack the humans, to make them fear the forest again, not just be spooked by it. A third faction emerged, the pragmatists. They saw the writing on the wall. They knew they couldn't win. Their leader, a wise old female Tanuki named Oriku, argued that their only hope for survival was to learn to live among the humans, to perfect their transformation skills, not to fight but to blend in, to become human, to get jobs, to buy food at a grocery store, to live in the very suburbs that were destroying their homes. To them, assimilation was the only alternative to extinction. The debates raged in moonlit clearings, growing more bitter with each new forest that fell. The fighters accused the assimilators of being traitors. The assimilators accused the fighters of leading them all to their doom. And the elders just watched in sorrow as their way of life crumbled from both without and within. Finally, a legendary elder, the wisest of them all, Master Tsuragame, called for a truce. He was over 1,000 years old, a master of transformation whose skills were the stuff of legend. He declared that their small-scale, disorganized efforts were pointless. Frightening a few workers here and there would achieve nothing. If they were to have any hope, any chance at all of stopping the human onslaught, they needed to do something drastic. They needed to pool all of their power, all of their knowledge, and all of their energy into one final cataclysmic operation. The plan was audacious. They would send out messengers to the far corners of Japan, to the islands of Shikoku and Sado, which were known strongholds of the greatest transformation masters left in the country. They would call these ancient, powerful Tanuki to their home in the Tama Hills, near the burgeoning megacity of Tokyo. Together, this council of masters, this gathering of legends, would combine their powers to unleash a supernatural event so massive, so terrifying and so undeniable, that it would shock the humans into abandoning their development forever. They would stage the ultimate ghost parade, a monstrous, city-sized illusion designed to scare an entire nation back into the age of myth. It was a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble, a final stand. For many, it represented their only hope. For others, it was a beautiful, glorious, and utterly hopeless fantasy. But the decision was made. The messengers were sent. And from across Japan, the old masters began their long journey, preparing to unleash the full, forgotten power of the Tanuki on the modern world. They came from the misty mountains of Shikoku and the windswept shores of Sado Island, ancient holdouts where the old ways still lingered. These weren't your average, everyday Tanuki. They were legends whispered about in burrows and dens. The first to arrive was the sixth Oroku, a formidable female elder, her fur the color of old parchment, her eyes holding the wisdom of 100 seasons. Then came Jayabu of the Yashima Temple, a hulking figure with a presence so powerful the very air seemed to bend around him. And finally, Hage of the Kincho clan, a master whose name alone commanded respect. They were the last true masters of the transformation arts, the forgotten science of illusion and metamorphosis known as Bakejutsu. For the young Tanuki of the Tama Hills, this was the stuff of bedtime stories. They watched wide-eyed as these living myths assembled. The masters explained that to save their home, to scare away the humans, they couldn't just be animals. They had to become something more. They had to become ghosts and gods and monsters. They had to become the humans' own worst fears, reflected back at them. And to do that, they needed to relearn the art that was their birthright. The fundamental Tanuki power, the one that defines them in 1,000 years of folklore, is shapeshifting. It's their signature move. In the old stories, a Tanuki doesn't just change its shape, it fundamentally alters reality around you. The classic image, the one you'll see in countless woodblock prints and statues, is a Tanuki with a single leaf placed upon its head. This leaf acts as a sort of magical catalyst, a focus point for its will. With intense concentration, it can then become, well, almost anything. It might become a rock by the side of the road, indistinguishable from any other, waiting for a weary traveler to pass. It might become a beautiful woman, luring a foolish man into the woods only to vanish, leaving him lost and confused. A favorite trick was to transform into a Buddhist monk, often with a mischievous glint in his eye, who would accept offerings of food and sake before revealing his true, furry form and scurrying away, chittering with laughter. One of the most famous tales is that of the Bunboku Chagama, the good fortune tea kettle. The story goes that a Tanuki, caught in a trap, is saved by a poor old man. To repay his kindness, the Tanuki transforms itself into a magnificent iron tea kettle. The man sells the kettle to a local temple, where the monks are astonished. This kettle can walk on a tightrope, dance, and perform all manner of acrobatics. It becomes a sensation, making the old man and the temple very wealthy. But whenever they try to put the kettle over a fire to boil water, well, it sprouts legs and a head and screams, "It's too hot," before running away. The Tanuki, in the end, brings great fortune, but always on its own mischievous terms. This is the essence of their transformation magic. It's not just about deception, it's about performance. It's about creating a story, a moment of pure, unadulterated weirdness in the fabric of everyday life. They could become inanimate objects, like a sake bottle that endlessly refills itself, or monstrous apparitions, like giant, one-eyed ghouls that would terrorize entire villages for a night. But their most challenging and most useful transformation was, of course, turning into a human. To become a human required immense skill. It wasn't just about getting the shape right. It was about the posture, the voice, the subtle mannerisms. A novice Tanuki might forget its tail, leaving it sticking out from under a kimono, or it might get distracted by a tasty-looking bug and let its long snout pop out for a second. But a master? A master could walk among humans for years completely undetected. They would infiltrate towns, study human behavior, their strange customs, their baffling machines, their weaknesses. And this was the knowledge the Tama Hills Tanuki desperately needed. They had to understand the enemy. But there's a second power. A power so unique, so bizarre, and so quintessentially Tanuki that it often gets censored or glossed over in versions of the stories told to the West. It is, without a doubt, the strangest superpower in all of mythology. I'm talking about their giant, magical, shape-shifting scrotum. Yes, you heard that right. In Japanese folklore, the male Tanuki's scrotum or kintama, which literally translates to golden balls, is not a fixed part of its anatomy. It is an infinitely malleable, incredibly durable, and magically versatile tool. This isn't a crude joke. It's a deeply ingrained part of their mythological identity, a symbol of fortune and expansive possibility. The artwork is unambiguous. You will see statues and paintings of Tanuki with their scrotum stretched out to absurd proportions, being used for an incredible variety of tasks. How big can it get? The traditional measurement in the old scrolls is 8 tatami mats. That's an area of about 140 square feet. Imagine a living, stretchable personal parachute, and you're starting to get the idea. And what did they do with this asset? Everything. They would stretch it out between two Tanuki to use as a giant fishing net to catch food from a river. They would inflate it and use it as a boat to cross a lake, sometimes with other Tanuki passengers riding on top. In a rainstorm, one Tanuki could stretch its scrotum over the entire group to act as a communal umbrella or a makeshift tent. It could be used as a weapon, swung like a massive club to knock out an opponent, or laid on the ground as a trap, a sticky blanket to ensnare an unsuspecting foe. They would even stretch it taut and use it as a drum, beating out complex rhythms in the forest night. There's a famous ukiyo-e print by the artist Utagawa Kuniyoshi from the 1840s titled Tanuki Attacking a Hunter's Camp. It is one of the most gloriously strange pieces of art you will ever see. It depicts a full-scale battle. One Tanuki is using its scrotum as a giant bludgeon to smash a cooking pot. Another has stretched its scrotum over the hunter's head, blinding him. A third has transformed its scrotum into a giant, monstrous face to terrify the man, while another uses its own as a decoy to lure the hunting dogs away. It is an image of pure, unbridled anatomical chaos. It's their secret weapon, the ultimate multi-tool, a biological Swiss Army knife of infinite potential. And so, back in the Tama Hills, under the stern gaze of the old masters, the training began. The young Tanuki were told to close their eyes, to feel the ancient power stirring within them. They were told to focus, to will themselves into new shapes, to transform, to stretch. It was a complete disaster. These were modern Tanuki. They had spent their lives scavenging from dumpsters and hiding from headlights. They hadn't needed these old magics. The art had atrophied. It was like asking a generation raised on calculators to suddenly perform complex calculus in their heads. One young Tanuki tried to turn into a statue of Jizo, a guardian deity, but he couldn't hold the form. His nose kept twitching, his ears drooped, and his tail kept popping out. Another tried to stretch his scrotum into a simple blanket and ended up tripping himself, getting tangled in a knot of his own making. They were clumsy, they were unfocused, and they were weak. The old masters looked on, their faces grim. Master Orica sighed, a deep rattling sound. "This is worse than I feared," she rasped. "They've forgotten who they are. They have the bodies of Tanuki, but the spirits of foxes." It was the ultimate insult. Foxes were their rivals, known for being sly, but Tanuki were the true masters of transformation, the grand illusionists. And this new generation, they couldn't even manage a simple teapot. The hope that had filled the clearing only hours before was rapidly draining away, replaced by a creeping dread. The bulldozers were getting closer every day. The forest was shrinking, and the supposed saviors of their kind, the inheritors of 1,000 years of magical tradition, couldn't even perform the most basic of their own spells. Time was running out, and their last best hope was proving to be no hope at all. The training was a disaster. The younger generation, raised on human scraps and forgotten lore, saw transformation as a party trick, not a sacred art. They could conjure a mushroom, maybe a statue, but the complex illusions needed to truly terrify humans were far beyond their grasp. The elders watched in dismay. Their entire strategy, their one great hope, was crumbling before it even began. And as the Tanuki bickered and failed, the sounds of construction echoed from the valley below, a constant, grinding reminder of their impending extinction. It was in this atmosphere of failure and despair that a new, more dangerous idea began to take root. It was championed by Ganta, a fiery red-furred Tanuki from the Aka forest. He was a traditionalist, a warrior, a creature of pure, undiluted rage. He stood before the assembled clans, his voice booming with righteous fury. He argued that their attempts at peaceful, clever tricks were a waste of time. The humans, he roared, were not creatures to be reasoned with or gently scared away. They were an infestation, a plague. They didn't respect the gods, they didn't respect nature, so why should the Tanuki respect them? Gonta's proposal was simple, brutal, and terrifying. He called for an immediate, all-out war. Not a war of illusions, but a war of sabotage and death. He spoke of derailing the bulldozers, of starting landslides to bury the construction sites, of attacking the human workers directly. He declared that every human killed was a victory for the forest. This was no longer about scaring them away, it was about exterminating the threat. For Gonta, this was a holy war, a final desperate crusade to reclaim their ancestral home. He painted a grim picture, a future where their children starved, where their sacred mountains were paved over for golf courses and soulless apartment blocks. Was it not better, he bellowed, to die fighting on their feet than to live on their knees, begging for scraps in the humans' concrete wasteland? His words resonated with the angriest and most desperate of the Tanuki. They saw the logic in his rage. They had tried being clever. They had tried to be subtle. And all it had gotten them was a smaller and smaller patch of dirt to call home. The appeal of direct, violent action was intoxicating. It was a way to channel their grief and helplessness into raw power. But then another elder spoke. The wise old matriarch Oroku. She was ancient, her fur the color of winter frost, and she commanded a different kind of respect. She did not shout. She did not rage. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the anger like a gentle stream cutting through stone. She agreed that the humans were a threat, that their actions were destroying the world. But she argued that Gonta's path led only to their own destruction. To kill the humans, she explained, was to become like them. It was to embrace the very same violence and disregard for life that they were fighting against. The Tanuki, she reminded them, were not murderers. They were tricksters. Their power was not in their claws, but in their wits and their connection to the spirit world. Oroku proposed a different strategy. Instead of a physical war, she called for a spiritual one. They needed to remind the humans of who they were sharing the world with. They needed to make the humans believe in the old magic again. For centuries, humans had feared and respected the yokai, the ghosts, demons, and spirits of Japan. But in this new age of science and industry, they had forgotten. They had convinced themselves that the supernatural wasn't real. Oroku's plan was to stage a massive, coordinated campaign of terror and illusion. A spectacular ghost parade, so terrifying, so undeniably real, that it would shake human civilization to its core. They would resurrect the old legends, bringing yokai from folklore to life. They would make the Tama Hills the most haunted place on Earth, a place so supernaturally terrifying that no human would dare set foot there again. It was a brilliant, audacious plan. It played to their strengths as masters of illusion. But there was one major problem. As they had just witnessed, most of the current Tanuki had lost the ability to perform such powerful transformations. They simply weren't skilled enough. The council was split. Gonta's call for immediate, violent action appealed to their desperation. Oroku's grand illusion appealed to their heritage and their nature as tricksters. Neither side would back down. The argument raged, threatening to tear their fragile alliance apart. Finally, a compromise was reached, proposed by the respected elder Saizeman. They would pursue both paths. Gonta and his followers would be allowed to begin their campaign of sabotage, but with a crucial limitation. They were forbidden from killing any humans. Their goal was to disrupt and delay, to cause accidents and create chaos, buying the others more time. Meanwhile, two of the most capable Tanuki, the handsome and charismatic Shikichi and the feisty Tamasaburo, would be sent as messengers. Their mission was to travel across Japan to the distant islands of Shikoku and Sado, legendary strongholds of Tanuki culture. There, it was rumored, lived ancient masters of transformation, Tanuki so powerful they were practically gods. These masters, if they could be convinced to help, possessed the knowledge and the magical power needed to make Oroku's ghost parade a reality. And so the great plan dubbed Project Yokai was set into motion. As the messengers set off on their perilous journey, Gonta's faction wasted no time. They began their assault under the cover of darkness. They used their limited transformation skills to become rocks that would roll in front of trucks, or disembodied lights that would lure workers into ditches. One particularly brave Tanuki transformed into a red-faced demon and chased a security guard, causing him to crash his truck into a power pole, plunging the entire construction site into darkness. These were small victories, pinpricks against a giant. The humans were confused and a little spooked, dismissing the events as freak accidents or local superstitions. The police reports spoke of faulty brakes and driver error. For every truck they disabled, 10 more arrived the next day. For every hour of work they delayed, the humans simply added another shift. The Tanuki's guerrilla war was a nuisance, but it wasn't stopping anything. The relentless march of progress continued, the steel skeletons of new buildings rising from the scarred earth like tombstones for a dying forest. The Tanuki celebrated their small acts of defiance, but a shadow of doubt hung over them. Their sabotage was not enough. Their hopes and the fate of their entire world now rested on the shoulders of their two messengers, traveling to lands they had only heard of in legends, searching for masters who might not even exist. And even if they did, would they be willing to help? And could they possibly arrive in time? The seasons were turning, and with every falling leaf, another piece of their home was gone forever. The ghost parade had to work. It was their last, best, and only chance. The decision was made under a sliver of a moon, in a clearing that smelled of damp earth and sawdust. There was no grand council, no formal vote. There was only the quiet, grim consensus of the elders, their faces etched with the worry of 1,000 generations. They could not create a ghost parade of sufficient power on their own. The transformation arts of the Tama Hills Tanuki were strong, but what they planned was not a simple trick to scare a lost traveler. This was a declaration of war, waged with illusion and fear. It required not just skill but genius. It required masters. And so, two of the youngest, swiftest Tanuki were chosen. Their names were Panta and Kyo. They were barely adults, their fur still thick with the sheen of youth, their minds still filled with games and mischief. But they were fast, and they knew the dwindling paths of the old world like the backs of their own paws. Their mission was twofold. First, to travel to the neighboring forests, to the clans of Musashino and Sagami, and beg for aid, to ask their cousins to join the fight, to lend their numbers and their strength to the great illusion. Second, and far more perilous, was to seek out the great masters, the living legends of their kind, whose names were only spoken in hushed, reverent tones. The journey itself was a nightmare their ancestors could never have imagined. The world had become a labyrinth of human things. They couldn't travel as the crow flies. They had to travel as the hunted do. They scurried through concrete culverts, the rush of foul water echoing around them, their sensitive noses burning with the chemical stench. They navigated the terrifying gauntlet of the superhighways, where metal beasts roared past in endless, deafening streams, their lights slicing through the darkness. The world was a flashing, screaming thing, a constant assault on the senses. More than once they had to freeze, flattening themselves into the shadows of a guardrail as a pair of headlights washed over them, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. Their first stop, the forests of Musashino, brought only heartbreak. They found the Tanuki there huddled and broken. Their own lands had been shrinking for years. They were thin, their fur was patchy, and their eyes held a deep, listless despair. When Panta and Kyo explained their plan, the elders of Musashino just shook their heads slowly. Illusions? One of them rasped, his voice thin as a dry leaf. We tried illusions. We tried tricks. We tried scaring them. They brought bulldozers. They brought priests to bless the land. They brought dogs. He shuddered. They do not fear the old spirits anymore. They have their own monsters made of steel and noise. Your fight is already lost. Discouraged but not defeated, Panta and Kyo pressed on. The Sagami clan was different. They were fiery, angry, their rage a palpable heat in the air. They hadn't given up. They had been fighting back in their own small ways, tripping workers, leading survey teams astray, causing minor equipment malfunctions. They listened to the plan for a ghost parade with glittering eyes. They loved the boldness of it, the sheer audacity, but they were fighters, not artists. Their transformations were crude, practical things, a convincing rock, a passable tree stump. They lacked the finesse, the deep understanding of human psychology needed to craft an illusion that would truly terrify. They pledged their support, their numbers, but admitted they could not lead the charge. You need the masters, their leader grunted. You need the ones who remember when the world was ours. And so, the second part of the mission began. They had to find the living legends. First, they traveled north into the deep mist-shrouded mountains to seek out the ancient Oraku. She was a sage, a hermit, a Tanuki so old it was said she had watched the first castles being built. They found her not in a den, but living within the gnarled, hollowed-out trunk of a 1,000-year-old camphor tree. Her fur was the color of frost and her eyes were like chips of obsidian, holding a stillness that was unnerving. She listened to their plea without a word, her gaze distant, as if she were watching events that had happened centuries ago. When they finished, she let out a long, slow sigh. "The ghost parade," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of wind through dead leaves. "A desperate, beautiful, foolish idea. We tried it once before, you know. Long ago, when the shoguns were clearing the plains. Did not work then. Humans, they have a stubborn refusal to see what they do not wish to believe. And now, they believe in nothing but what they can hold in their hands. You are asking me to help you weave a tapestry of fear for men who have forgotten what it feels like to be afraid of the dark." She seemed ready to refuse to send them away. But then Kiyo, the quieter of the two messengers, spoke up. "Please," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "It is not just for us. It is for the forest. For the memory of what this land was. If we do nothing, that memory dies with us." A flicker of something, pain or perhaps respect, crossed the ancient Tanuki's face. She closed her eyes. "I will consider it," was all she said. Their next journey took them south, to the island of Shikoku, a place legendary for its powerful Tanuki clans. Here they sought Kincho VI, the proud and powerful descendant of a mythical line of Tanuki heroes. They found him holding court in a vast, sprawling den complex, surrounded by his loyal followers. Kincho was the opposite of Oraku. He was huge, boisterous, and brimming with a ferocious energy. He didn't see this as a last-ditch defense. He saw it as a glorious opportunity. "The humans of the mainland have grown soft," he boomed, his voice echoing through the den. "They've forgotten the power of the yokai. They think we are nothing but cute, pot-bellied statues outside their noodle shops. A ghost parade. Yes, we will remind them. We will conjure nightmares from their own folklore. We will show them legions of samurai ghosts, spectral giants, and the wailing spirits of 1,000 forgotten gods. We will make them fear the night again." He was all in, his passion a roaring fire that reignited the hope in Ponta and Kiyo's chests. He promised to bring his finest shapeshifters, Tanuki whose skills were honed not just for hiding, but for performance, for battle. One master remained, the most difficult and perhaps the most important, the legendary Jayabu, known also as the bald Tanuki of Yashima. Jayabu was not a sage or a general. He was a trickster, a master of psychological warfare. His illusions were said to be so profound they could drive a person mad, to make them question the very nature of reality itself. He was a chaotic force, brilliant and utterly unpredictable. Finding him was the hardest part. He had no court, no ancient tree. He was a wanderer. They followed rumors, whispers on the wind, stories from other yokai. They finally tracked him to the outskirts of a bustling human city, where he was amusing himself by making it appear as if the brand new traffic lights were melting into puddles of colored goo. Jayabu was wiry and energetic, with a perpetually amused glint in his eye. He listened to their story while effortlessly transforming a nearby discarded newspaper into a flock of fluttering white birds. "So the little Tama Tanuki want to put on a show," he mused, a wide grin spreading across his face. "And not just any show. The big one. The Hayaki Yagyo. Oh, that has potential. Real potential." He stopped his tricks, and for a moment, his expression became intensely serious. "But you can't just throw scary monsters at them. That's amateur hour. Today's humans, their fears are different. They aren't afraid of ghosts in the woods. They're afraid of the stock market crashing. They're afraid of strange chemicals in their food. They're afraid of their skyscrapers collapsing." His grin returned, wider and more manic than before. "To scare a modern human, you don't show them a demon. You show them their own world twisted. You make their cranes and excavators move on their own at night. You make a brand new building look ancient and haunted overnight. You project the ghosts of laid-off workers onto the walls of their corporate headquarters. You don't attack their bodies. You attack their sense of order, their belief in progress." Ponta and Kiyo stared at him, mesmerized. He wasn't just talking about shape-shifting. He was talking about a completely different philosophy of fear. This was the genius they needed. So will you help us? Panta asked, his voice full of awe. Jayabu let out a sharp laugh. Help you? My dear boy, an opportunity like this? A canvas this large? I wouldn't miss it for all the sake in Japan. The journey back was filled with a new, terrifying kind of hope. It was one thing to decide to fight. It was another thing entirely to have the living gods of your people agree to lead the charge. When Panta and Kiyo returned to the Tama Hills, they did not bring an army. They brought something far more valuable. They brought a strategist, a general, and a mad genius. As the three masters emerged from the shadows and into the clearing, a hush fell over the assembled Tanuki. Oriku, ancient and solemn as the mountains. Kincho, proud and radiating power. And Jayabu, his eyes dancing with chaotic light. They were the last hope of the Tanuki, the last masters of a dying art, gathered for one final spectacular performance. The real work, the impossible work, was about to begin. The first great council of the Tanuki nation began not with a roar, but with a yawn and a belch, followed by a heated argument over a half-eaten persimmon. From every corner of the Tama Hills they had come, a shuffling, chattering, pot-bellied sea of fur. They were drawn by the summons of the three masters, a call that echoed in the old magic of their blood. But looking at them now, sprawled under the moonlight, picking fleas and telling bawdy jokes, they looked less like an army and more like a badly managed daycare. Jayabu of Sato, his face a mask of military granite, stood on a high rock and surveyed his troops. It was, to put it mildly, a disaster. He cleared his throat, a sound like grinding stones. The chattering continued. He stamped a foot, sending a tremor through the rock. A few Tanuki looked up, blinked, and went back to a game of rock-paper-scissors played with their paws. Finally, Inugami Gyubu, the lord of Shikoku, let out a sigh that rustled the leaves in the entire forest. He simply expanded, not in a puff of smoke, but a slow, terrifying growth, his form swelling until he blotted out the moon, his 808 followers appearing as a silent, disciplined legion behind him. His eyes, now the size of lanterns, glowed with an ancient blue fire. Silence. Absolute terrified silence. Every single potbelly was sucked in. Every flea was frozen mid-jump. We are here, Inugami's voice boomed, not from his mouth but from the wind itself, because our world is ending. The humans are coming. They are not coming with offerings of sake and fried tofu. They are coming with iron claws that rip the skin from the earth. They will tear down our homes, foul our streams, and pave over the bones of our ancestors. They will turn this sacred forest into a new town. He said the words like a curse. A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. This they understood. They had seen the survey stakes. They had smelled the foul smoke of the human machines on the horizon. Then Jayabu spoke, his voice sharp and cutting. You will learn the old ways, the arts of transformation, the science of illusion. You will become ghosts, monsters, gods. You will learn discipline. You will learn to fight. This was met with a different kind of murmur, a skeptical, whining one. A young, cocky Tanuki from the front called out, "Fight? Why? My cousin knows a guy who lives behind a tempura restaurant in the city. He's fat as a prize-winning melon. Says the living is great." Another chimed in, "Yeah, and transformation is hard work. It makes my head hurt. Can't we just, move?" Jayabu's eye twitched. He looked ready to descend from the rock and personally throttle the entire assembly. But before he could, the ancient master Hage shuffled forward. He was so old his fur was the color of winter frost, and he leaned heavily on a gnarled walking stick. He didn't shout. He didn't grow. He just began to speak, his voice raspy and quiet, yet it carried to the furthest ear. "Do you know why we learn to change?" he asked softly. "It is not to fight. It is not to be human. It is to be more Tanuki. It is to remind the world that it is not a dead thing to be carved up. It is alive. It is full of mischief and wonder and teeth. Our magic is the laughter of the earth. When we change a leaf into a gold coin, we are not just tricking a merchant. We are reminding him that value is an illusion. When we make a phantom army march through the woods, we are not just scaring a woodcutter. We are reminding him that there are things in the shadows older and more powerful than he can imagine." He tapped his staff on the ground. "They want to build a new town of straight lines and cold concrete. They have forgotten the crooked path, the wild heart. We will not fight them with swords and spears. We will fight them with chaos. We will fight them with fear. We will drive them mad with wonder. We will wage a war of the imagination. A different kind of energy began to stir in the crowd. This sounded more like it. This sounded like fun. And so the Great Tanuki Boot Camp began. It was, for the first few weeks, an unmitigated catastrophe. Jayabu, a natural drill sergeant, tried to implement a rigorous training schedule. He'd line them up for shapeshifting drills. "All right, you worthless sacks of fur. On my mark, transform into a Jizo statue. Ready, go." The result was a field of abominations. One Tanuki managed the stone texture but kept his fluffy tail. Another got the shape right but couldn't stop his belly from rumbling. Most just turned into lumpy, vaguely person-shaped rocks before giving up and taking a nap. Their attempts at creating phantom noises resulted in a symphony of burps and flatulence. Their efforts at invisibility usually just meant hiding behind a slightly too small bush. Jayabu was losing his mind. He saw them using their legendary scrotums not for illusion craft, but as rain hats, picnic blankets, and makeshift drums. He watched them try to turn leaves into money, only to get distracted and try to eat the leaves instead. They were hopeless, lazy, undisciplined, and utterly obsessed with food and sleep. It was Master Hage who changed tactics. He abandoned Jayabu's rigid drills and instead turned their training into a festival. He held contests. Who could create the most convincing illusion of a giant noodle bowl? Who could tell the most terrifying ghost story by changing their face in the firelight? Who could best impersonate a local politician and order 1,000 pounds of fried chicken delivered to the forest? Suddenly, the Tanuki were interested. This wasn't work, it was a party. They started competing, showing off, pushing the limits of their innate talent for trickery. They learned to work together, weaving their illusions into a greater whole. A group of them managed to create a perfect replica of a human construction vehicle, only for it to fall apart into a pile of giggling Tanuki when a foreman approached. It was a failure, but it was a glorious failure. They were learning. The final piece of the puzzle was Inugami Gyubu. One night, when morale was high and the sake was flowing, he gathered them at the edge of the forest, overlooking the distant, glittering lights of the human city. He told them that their small tricks were good, but they needed to think bigger. They weren't just scaring individuals. They were trying to haunt an entire generation of humans. They had to create a spectacle so vast, so terrifying, so unexplainably weird, that the developers would abandon the project in superstitious dread. To show them what he meant, he took a deep breath. And the city vanished. One moment, the sprawling metropolis was there. The next, it was gone, replaced by a churning, ancient sea under a blood-red moon. Ghostly ships with tattered sails drifted on the waves, and the shriek of phantom gulls echoed where skyscrapers had stood. The Tanuki stared, their sake gourds dropping from their paws. They could feel the phantom spray of the salt water on their faces, smell the rot of the ancient wood. It was an illusion on a scale they had never dreamed of. It felt more real than reality itself. Just as quickly, the city reappeared, humming along, completely unaware that for a few breathtaking moments, it had ceased to exist. Inugami Gyubu, back to his normal size, looked at the stunned faces around him. "That," he said, his voice a low rumble, "is what we are capable of when we work together. That is the power you have forgotten." From that moment on, everything changed. The games stopped being just games. The training took on a feverish intensity. They weren't just learning tricks anymore. They were rehearsing. They were artists preparing for their grand debut. The masters gathered them and laid out the final plan. It was audacious. It was insane. It was pure, unadulterated Tanuki. They would not attack the humans. They would not harm them. They would orchestrate a single massive coordinated event. A haunting. A parade of monsters, gods, and demons drawn from 1,000 years of Japanese folklore. They would call it Operation Spectre. It would be a ghost story brought to life. A supernatural carnival of terror designed to sever the humans' connection to this land, to make them believe the very hills were rising up against them. They would turn the entire Tama forest into the world's biggest haunted house. And so they began. The greatest act of shapeshifting in the history of their kind. The Tanuki called it Operation Spectre, and it required every ounce of their collective power. For months, the young Tanuki were put through rigorous training by the transformation masters, Oroku and Ganta. They learned to hold complex forms, to project illusions not just of sight, but of sound and even feeling. They studied ancient scrolls depicting the yokai, the spirits and monsters of old Japan, relearning the forms their ancestors had long forgotten. This wasn't about turning into a teapot or a statue anymore. This was about resurrecting an entire mythology. The night of the parade arrived. The air over the Tama Hills grew heavy, thick with a strange, otherworldly energy. From the shadows of the forest, they emerged, not as raccoon dogs, but as a procession of nightmares ripped from the pages of folklore. Giant, skeletal figures, the Gashidakuro, strode between the half-built houses, their bony fingers scraping against the rooftops. Processions of Chachinobe, one-eyed paper lantern ghosts, floated silently down the newly paved streets, their single unblinking eyes casting a terrifying red glow. They were a living, breathing ukiyo-e woodblock print come to life. There were rokurokubi, women whose necks stretched to impossible lengths, peering into the second-story windows of terrified families. Naprabo, the faceless ghost, stood under streetlights, turning to reveal a horrifying, smooth blankness where their features should be. Kitsune, the fox spirits, marched alongside them, their 9 tails weaving intricate patterns in the air, leading a spectral wedding procession that promised only doom. The Tanuki didn't just imitate these creatures. They became them, channeling the primal fear these spirits had evoked for centuries. The sound was a symphony of dread, the clatter of bones, the whisper of silk kimonos with no one inside them, the mournful cry of spirits lost between worlds. This was the Hayaki Yagyo, the night parade of 100 demons. In Japanese folklore, this is a terrifying event, a night when all the yokai, oni, and spirits leave their domains and march through the streets in a massive, chaotic procession. It was said that any mortal who witnessed this parade would perish instantly, or be spirited away, unless they had the protection of a sutra or a powerful charm. It was the ultimate expression of the supernatural world's power, a reminder to humans to stay indoors, to lock their doors, and to respect the boundaries of the night. The Tanuki were weaponizing this ancient, deep-seated cultural fear. They weren't just scaring people. They were trying to trigger a kind of spiritual panic, to convince the humans that they had trespassed on haunted ground, a place so fundamentally unwelcoming that their only option was to flee. And at first it worked. The initial reports were frantic. People called the police, babbling about monsters and ghosts marching down Main Street. News crews, smelling a sensational story, scrambled their helicopters. The footage they captured was breathtaking and utterly inexplicable. It was chaos. It was terror. It was the Tanuki's masterpiece of illusion. Standing on a distant hill, the elders watched with grim satisfaction. The humans were panicking. The fear was spreading. The forest, it seemed, was fighting back. But then something shifted. The 20th century, with its relentless logic and its insatiable appetite for spectacle, reacted in a way the Tanuki could never have predicted. The fear, so potent for a moment, began to curdle into something else. Curiosity, then fascination, then entertainment. The news anchors, after their initial shock, started describing the event with a kind of breathless excitement. Experts were brought on camera, not to warn of a supernatural apocalypse, but to debate the special effects. Was it a projection? A publicity stunt? Some kind of elaborate hoax? The very idea that it could be real was dismissed almost immediately. The human mind, so adept at rationalizing the unknown, simply couldn't accept what it was seeing. It had to be a trick. And if it was a trick, it was the most amazing trick anyone had ever seen. The tone of the coverage changed from a horror story to a rave review. The final soul-crushing blow came a few days later. As the Tanuki watched the news, exhausted but hopeful, a man appeared on screen. He was the owner of a nearby theme park, a brand new fantasy-themed attraction called Wonderland. With a smug grin, he took full credit for the entire event. The Ghost Parade, he announced, was just a promotional preview for his park's grand opening. He praised the actors and the special effects team for their incredible realism. He invited everyone to come to Wonderland to experience the magic for themselves. The humans bought it completely. The story wasn't ancient spirits reclaimed their ancestral land. The story was local businessman pulls off marketing stunt of the century. The fear vanished, replaced by admiration for the supposed creator's ingenuity. The parade became a viral sensation. People shared clips of the Gashidakuro and the faceless ghosts, not with terror, but with comments like, "This is awesome," and "I gotta see this." The sacred, desperate act of the Tanuki, their ultimate weapon forged from their very essence and cultural memory, had been misunderstood, co-opted, and turned into a commercial. It was no longer a supernatural warning. It was an advertisement. For the Tanuki, this was a defeat more profound than any bulldozer. They had poured their souls into this illusion. They had resurrected the gods and monsters of their world to plead their case, to scream their pain. And the humans hadn't just ignored the message, they had applauded the performance and bought a ticket to the show. The despair that fell over the Tanuki community was absolute. Their greatest magic, their most powerful tradition, was not only ineffective against the modern world, it was effortlessly absorbed by it. It was just another piece of content, another distraction in a world already saturated with them. The failure of Operation Spectre fractured the Tanuki resistance. The different factions, once united in a common cause, now splintered in their grief and anger. The charismatic, moderate leader, Ganta, who had always advocated for fighting back, became radicalized. He saw the humans' reaction not just as a misunderstanding, but as a declaration of war. If they couldn't be scared away, he argued, then they must be driven away by force. His rhetoric turned dark, shifting from illusion and intimidation to outright violence. He began to speak of a human elimination campaign, a true war against the developers, believing it was the only path left. Meanwhile, the wise old matriarch Oriku saw the writing on the wall. She believed the fight was already lost. The world of humans was too powerful, its culture too absorbent. Their magic, their very way of life, was becoming obsolete. Her faction argued for a different kind of survival, assimilation. They proposed that the only way for the Tanuki to survive was to use their transformation skills to blend in, to become human, to abandon the forest and live secretly among their conquerors. It was a strategy of cultural surrender, a painful but pragmatic choice to preserve their lives, even if it meant losing their identity. And then there were the others, like the respected elder Tsurugame, who proposed a third, desperate option. They would seek help from the legendary Kitsune, the fox spirits, who were rumored to be even more powerful and cunning shapeshifters than the Tanuki. It was a long shot, a journey to a distant land to find allies who may not even exist anymore. A final desperate appeal to the last vestiges of Japan's fading magical world. 3 factions, 3 impossible choices: to fight a hopeless war, to surrender their very nature, or to chase a fading myth. The Tanuki community was broken, their grand unity shattered by the deafening indifference of the modern world. Their haunted house had failed, and now the ghosts were starting to turn on each other. The blame game began almost immediately. It was a poison that seeped into the dens, turning allies into accusers. The elders who had orchestrated the grand spectacle were now decried as fools, their ancient magic nothing more than parlor tricks against the relentless march of steel and concrete. The younger, more impulsive Tanuki, who had thrown themselves into the illusions with wild abandon, were accused of recklessness, of not understanding the true gravity of their situation. Every conversation was laced with resentment. Every glance was heavy with suspicion. The forest, once a sanctuary of shared purpose, now echoed with the bitter sounds of a family tearing itself apart. In the heart of this despair, a new voice began to rise. It was a voice that didn't whisper of forgotten magic or plead for clever tricks. It was a roar. It belonged to a Tanuki named Ganta, a fierce, uncompromising leader from the aka forest. Ganta was built like a boulder, his eyes burning with a righteous fire that many found intoxicating. He saw their failure not as a weakness of their power, but as a failure of their will. He stood before the fractured assembly, his voice cutting through the murmurs of defeat. He argued that they had been playing a child's game. They had tried to scare the humans, to spook them like timid deer. But humans, Ganta bellowed, were not deer. They were wolves. And you don't scare a wolf by rattling chains in the attic. You fight it. You break its teeth. His message was simple, brutal, and for many deeply seductive. Why, he asked, should they, the true inhabitants of this land, be the ones to hide? Why should they be forced to beg for scraps of their own home? The humans weren't just ignorant, they were invaders. They weren't just building homes. They were digging graves for the Tanuki, for the foxes, for the very soul of the mountain. The time for games was over. The time for shapeshifting into teapots and spooky lanterns had passed. It was time, he declared, for war. Not a war of illusions, but a war of sabotage, of disruption, of direct action. He proposed they use their transformation skills not to create ghosts, but to become human themselves. to walk among the enemy, to learn their ways, to infiltrate their construction sites and bring their monstrous machines grinding to a halt. This was a radical departure, a terrifying leap into the unknown. For generations, the Tanuki's greatest rule was to avoid direct, prolonged conflict. Their strength was in their cleverness, their ability to misdirect and confuse, not in brute force. Gonta was asking them to abandon the very essence of their survival strategy. He was asking them to become the monsters the humans already believed them to be. The idea spread like wildfire through the disillusioned youth. They were tired of hiding, tired of feeling helpless. Gonta's words gave their anger a target, their fear a purpose. They saw him not as a radical, but as a savior. They began to rally around him, their chants for action growing louder, more fervent. But the elders, the ones who remembered past conflicts and the terrible price of human retribution, were horrified. One of them, the wise and ancient matriarch Oriku, stepped forward to challenge Gonta. Her fur was the color of winter frost, and her eyes held the wisdom of 100 seasons. She spoke not with a roar, but with a calm, steady voice that commanded a different kind of authority. She reminded them of who they were. They were not creatures of hate. Their magic was one of joy, of mischief, of creating wonder and confusion, not destruction and death. To fight the humans on their terms, she warned, was to lose themselves. They would become just as savage, just as destructive as the thing they were fighting. If they were to use their powers to harm, to kill, the magic itself would turn on them, souring their spirits and twisting their hearts. She pleaded with them to remember the old ways, the path of harmony. Yes, the humans were destroying their home, but they were also a force of nature, like a typhoon or an earthquake. You don't declare war on a typhoon. You endure it. You find a way to survive in the world it leaves behind. She urged them to focus their energy not on a futile war, but on finding a new way to live, to adapt, to preserve their culture in the cracks and shadows of the human world. It was a message of patience, of resilience, of immense heartbreaking sorrow, but also of hope. The debate raged. Gonta countered Oriku's wisdom with raw emotional appeals. He pointed to the flattened forests, the polluted streams. "Is this the harmony you speak of, old mother?" he snarled. "Is this the world you want us to adapt to? A world of pavement and poison? I would rather die fighting for the world that was, than live as a rat in the world they are building." He accused Oriku and the other elders of cowardice, of being so afraid of death that they had forgotten how to live. He painted their wisdom as weakness, their caution as surrender. You could feel the soul of the Tanuki community being torn in two. On one side, the desperate, angry youth, drawn to the siren song of glorious battle. On the other, the weary, cautious elders, who understood the terrible, unwinnable nature of that battle. It was a choice between a beautiful, honorable death and a long, difficult, compromised life. In the end, the division was too deep to heal. Gonta, his voice thick with conviction, made his final declaration. He would not stand by and watch his home be paved into a parking lot. He and those who believed in him would take matters into their own paws. They would become the saboteurs, the eco-terrorists, the vengeful spirits the humans whispered about in their stories. They would make the humans fear the forest again. He turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his followers. "Who is with me?" he roared. "Who will fight for our home?" A wave of young, determined Tanuki surged forward, their shouts of allegiance echoing Gonta's own. They were the ones who had lost the most, the ones with the least to lose. They chose the path of fire. Oriku watched them, her heart breaking. She saw not an army, but a funeral procession. She and the other traditionalists, along with the more pragmatic Tanuki who simply wanted to find a way to survive, could only look on in silence. There were no more arguments to be made. The line had been drawn. With a final defiant cry, Gonta led his faction away from the gathering, their paws thumping a determined rhythm on the forest floor. They were marching toward the human world, not with illusions and tricks, but with a newfound deadly purpose. They were no longer just mischievous spirits. They were soldiers in a war of their own making, and as they disappeared into the shadows of the encroaching city, those left behind felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The community was not just broken, it was now at war with the humans and perhaps with itself. The greatest tragedy was no longer the loss of their forest, but the loss of their unity, a schism that threatened to consume them all long before the first human bulldozer ever could. The forest floor, once a stage for joyous celebration, became a war council chamber. On one side stood Ganta, his eyes burning with a righteous fire, his followers a tense collection of hardened survivors ready to trade their lives for a chance at vengeance. On the other, the elder matriarch Oroku and the traditionalists, their faces etched with a deep, weary sorrow. They argued not over whether to fight, but how. Ganta's faction advocated for direct, violent confrontation, used their shapeshifting to cause accidents, to sabotage equipment, to make the humans fear the very ground they sought to conquer. Oroku's followers pleaded for a different path, one of illusion and misdirection, to scare the humans away without bloodshed, to remind them of the spirits they were displacing. But Ganta's rage was a wildfire, and it was spreading. His first campaigns were brutal and effective. A lone Tanuki, transformed into a faceless construction worker, would subtly misdirect a crane, sending a steel girder crashing down just feet from a work crew. Another, appearing as a shadowy child darting across a road, would cause a supply truck to swerve and overturn, its contents spilling uselessly across the asphalt. They became poltergeists in the machine, glitches in the system of progress. At night, they would mimic the sounds of crying ghosts around the temporary housing, preying on the superstitions of the workers, driving them to quit in terror. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it seemed to be working. Construction slowed. Accidents mounted. The project was plagued by what the humans called a streak of impossibly bad luck. But the humans did not see spirits. They saw liability issues. They didn't see an ancient forest defending itself. They saw a need for better safety protocols and nighttime security. For every worker that fled in fear, 2 more arrived, lured by hazard pay. For every piece of sabotaged equipment, newer, more powerful machines were brought in. The human response was not fear, it was efficiency. They were a tide of concrete and steel, and the Tanuki's desperate attacks were like throwing stones into a tsunami. Worse, the violence began to escalate. A Tanuki, cornered by security guards, lashed out in its true form, injuring a man. The story hit the local news. Vicious raccoon dogs attack workers. The narrative was set. The Tanuki were no longer mischievous spirits. They were rabid pests. And pests were to be exterminated. Traps were set. Poisons were laid. The war Ganta had wanted was here, and it was a massacre. The cost was unbearable. Tanuki were lost not just to the traps and bulldozers, but to the sheer exhaustion of their transformations. The constant shapeshifting drained their life force, aging them prematurely. The forest echoed with mourning. Ganta's rage, once a rallying cry, now tasted like ash in their mouths. The schism had become a wound, and it was bleeding the life out of their community. It was in this moment of absolute despair that a new desperate idea was forged. A plan so audacious, so grand, it would require every last Tanuki, Ganta's warriors and Oroku's traditionalists, to unite for one final spectacular act. They would not attack the humans directly. They would attack their reality. They would remind the modern world of the magic it had paved over. They would orchestrate the great yokai parade, the night parade of 100 demons. It was a legend from the oldest scrolls, a feat of collective transformation so powerful, it was said to blur the line between the physical and the spiritual worlds. It would take all of them. The elders who held the knowledge of the ancient forms would guide the young, whose raw energy was needed to power the illusion. For weeks the fighting stopped. The rival factions, bound by a shared fading hope, worked side by side. They practiced in secret, deep within the shrinking remnants of their forest. They learned to sync their minds, to pool their energy, weaving their individual transformations into a single cohesive tapestry of terror and wonder. They would not be ghosts in the machine. They would become a ghost of the machine, a spectacular phantasmagoria marching right through the heart of the new city. The night they chose was moonless and still. As the last lights in the new suburban homes winked out, a strange energy began to build at the edge of the forest. It started as a whisper, a shimmer in the air. Then it began. Out of the darkness they marched. Not as Tanuki, but as the forgotten nightmares of Japan. Giant skeletons, taller than the houses, strode down the perfectly paved streets, their bony feet cracking the asphalt. Long-necked women, the rokurokubi, peered into second-story windows with unnerving smiles. Hordes of one-eyed kappa and red-faced oni brandished clubs, their guttural roars echoing off the cookie-cutter facades. Paper lanterns with grotesque faces floated through the air, casting an eerie glow on processions of faceless spirits and monstrous foxwomen. It was a masterpiece of illusion, a living, breathing ukiyo-e print brought to life. It was the soul of old Japan rising from its grave to protest its own burial. The effect on the humans was immediate and profound. People awoke, drawn to their windows by the unearthly sounds. They stared, mouths agape, their modern sensibilities completely unprepared for the mythological horror unfolding on their manicured lawns. Car alarms blared. People screamed, fumbling for their phones to record the impossible. News helicopters scrambled to the scene, captured breathtaking footage of the ghostly parade. For one glorious night, the Tanuki had succeeded. They had peeled back the veil of the mundane and shown humanity the terrifying magical world they were destroying. They had shattered the modern world's sense of order. Exhausted, their life energies almost completely spent, the Tanuki retreated to the forest just before dawn, collapsing in heaps, many of the elders having given their very lives for the illusion. But they were triumphant. Surely now the humans would understand. Surely they would leave. The next day the world was buzzing. The footage was everywhere. It was the top story on every news channel, the #1 trending topic globally. Pundits and experts debated its meaning. Was it mass hysteria? A coordinated prank? A genuine supernatural event? The Tanuki watched from the edge of their woods, waiting for the bulldozers to be packed up, for the humans to retreat in fear. Then the news conference happened. A man in an expensive suit, the president of the company developing the land, stood at a podium beaming. He laughed. He announced that he was proud to take credit for the yokai parade. He called it the most successful viral marketing campaign in history, a brilliant large-scale holographic projection test for his company's new theme park, Wonderland, which was being built right there. He praised his marketing team's ingenuity for creating such a realistic and terrifying PR stunt. The blow was more devastating than any bulldozer. Their ultimate act of spiritual warfare, the final desperate cry from their collective soul, had been absorbed, sanitized, and rebranded as a commercial. It hadn't been seen as a warning from the gods, but as an advertisement for a roller coaster. The magic that had defined their existence, the power they had bled and died for, was dismissed as clever technology. The humans weren't scared, they were impressed. In fact, the stunt made the new development even more popular. Property values skyrocketed. The place was famous now. The destruction of the forest didn't stop. It accelerated. That was the moment the last light of hope went out in Ganta's eyes. He had tried reason. He had tried violence. He had even for a moment tried art and magic. And all of it had failed. The humans did not just conquer, they assimilated. They turned rebellion into entertainment, reduced sacred power to a marketing gimmick. There was nothing left to say. There were no more plans to be made. There was only rage, pure and absolute. As the other Tanuki lay in a state of catatonic despair, their spirits utterly broken, Ganta rose. He let out a cry that was not a call to arms, but a howl of pure nihilistic grief. And with his last loyal followers, he launched a final suicidal charge, not to win but to die fighting. They ran from the dying forest, transforming one last time not into ghosts or illusions, but into a wave of fury, aimed directly at the cold, impartial steel of the machines that had devoured their world. It was a charge born of desperation, a final defiant scream against the inevitable. There was no grand strategy, no hope of victory. It was the last page of their story, and they chose to write it in blood and fury. The humans, caught off guard, saw only a stampede of monstrous specters, a parade of nightmares clawing at their bulldozers. But for the Tanuki, it was an act of pure, tragic honesty. For one last moment, they were not tricksters, not ghosts, but the raw, wounded spirit of the mountain itself, lashing out at its destroyers. The charge, of course, broke against the unyielding wall of progress. Steel is not swayed by courage, and engines do not feel fear. The battle was over before it began. The aftermath was a profound, aching silence. The last echo of their war cry faded, replaced by the relentless hum of machinery. The great illusion was shattered. The forest was gone. And so the age of the gods, the age of magic, ended. Not with a bang, but with the quiet crunch of earth under metal treads. The surviving Tanuki were faced with a choice more terrible than any battle. What do you do when your entire world has been erased? When the very ground that defined your existence is now a grid of asphalt and concrete? Some, the old masters of transformation, chose a final spectacular illusion. They gathered what remained of their power and wove a grand deception. They couldn't bring the mountains back, but they could project a ghost of them. For the humans, it was a miracle. A beautifully developed park, a pristine-looking slice of countryside preserved amidst the urban sprawl. But for the Tanuki, it was a gilded cage, a phantom limb. They lived within their own beautiful lie, a constant, painful reminder of everything they had lost. Others, the ones who could still pass for ordinary animals, made a different choice. They assimilated. They became part of the human world, a world they had fought so hard against. They learned to navigate the concrete rivers and steel canyons. They learned the rhythms of this new, alien ecosystem. The fox, their clever rival, had already made this leap, becoming a creature of the city's edge. Now the Tanuki had to follow. They put away their tricks, their transformations, their sake gourds and promissory notes. They became, for all intents and purposes, simple raccoon dogs. And this right here is where the magnificent, heartbreaking fiction of Studio Ghibli's Poko bleeds directly into our reality. Because that film isn't just a fairy tale. It is the most poignant, most accurate allegory for what has happened, and is still happening, to the real Tanuki of Japan. The Tama Hills, the setting of the film, are a real place. And the urban development depicted was a real project that began in the 1960s, a sprawling suburban expansion of Tokyo. As the forests were cleared for housing complexes, the real Tanuki who lived there were displaced, their homes destroyed, their populations decimated. They faced the exact same choice as their animated counterparts: adapt or disappear. And adapt they did. Today, the Tanuki is one of Japan's most successful urban adapters. They are the ultimate survivors. They have traded forested mountains for the tangled green of railway embankments. They've swapped hollow logs for storm drains and the crawl spaces under houses. Their diet, once wild berries and insects, is now whatever they can scavenge from overflowing garbage cans and unattended pet food bowls. They have become ghosts in the machine, nocturnal phantoms that flit through the alleyways of the world's largest metropolis. A resident of Tokyo might go their whole life without seeing one, yet they are everywhere. Their greatest shapeshifting trick is no longer turning into a monk or a teapot. Their greatest trick is becoming invisible in plain sight. They are the rustle in the bushes in a city park at midnight. They are the fleeting shadow that darts across the road, just at the edge of your headlights. And this brings us to the Tanuki's most lethal modern enemy, a monster far more terrifying than any ancient demon: the automobile. In Japan, thousands upon thousands of Tanuki are killed on the roads every year. It's such a common tragedy that road signs bearing their image are a frequent sight on highways, a silent plea for drivers to slow down. For an animal whose primary defense mechanism for millennia was to feign death, to freeze and play dead, the 2 tons of steel approaching at 60 miles an hour is a foe their instincts simply cannot comprehend. The blinding glare of headlights, the shriek of tires on asphalt, this is the final terrifying monster they could never trick. Their relationship with modern humans is as complicated as their folklore. On one hand, they are beloved icons. The ceramic shigaraki statues, with their big bellies and straw hats, are everywhere, welcoming patrons to restaurants and homes. They are cute characters in video games and anime, symbols of good fortune and generosity. This cultural footprint is immense. It has likely saved them from the fate of other pest animals. You don't see statues of rats or crows inviting you in for a bowl of ramen. But on the other hand, the real, living Tanuki is often seen as a nuisance. They dig up gardens. They get into trash. They can carry diseases like scabies, which gives them a wretched appearance and turns public sympathy into disgust. They live in a strange limbo, adored as a cartoon, but often reviled as a neighbor. They are a myth that has come uncomfortably alive, and we don't quite know what to do with them. So what is the legacy of this strange, magical, resilient creature? The Tanuki is a living bridge between 2 worlds. It is the Japan of old, of forests, spirits, and folklore, stubbornly refusing to be erased by the Japan of new, of concrete, commerce, and convenience. They are a testament to the sheer, bloody-minded resilience of nature. You can pave over a paradise, but life will find a way. It will grow in the cracks. It will make a home in the ruins. The Tanuki's story is a mirror. We see in them our own complicated relationship with the natural world we've displaced. We box it up into parks and preserves, we turn animals into cute mascots, all while the real thing struggles for survival just beyond our backyard fence. We love the idea of nature, but the reality of it, the messiness, the inconvenience, is something we constantly try to control. But the Tanuki resists control. It has always been a creature of the in-between, the borderlands. Not quite a dog, not quite a raccoon, not a god, but more than an animal. And now it lives in the ultimate borderland, the margin between the wild and the city. And perhaps in a way the magic is still there. Maybe the shapeshifting was never about literally changing form. Maybe it was always a metaphor for adaptation, the ability to change, to become what you need to be to survive. In that sense, the Tanuki are more powerful magicians now than they have ever been. They have transformed themselves into creatures of the Anthropocene, survivors of the world we built. The next time you see a picture of Japan, a dazzling shot of the Tokyo skyline at night, remember who else is living in that picture. Remember that down in the shadows between the skyscrapers and neon signs, a small furry trickster is making its way through the night. It isn't wearing a straw hat or carrying a bottle of sake. It's just a wild animal on a desperate nightly search for a meal. But it is also the heir to 1,000 years of stories. It is a living myth. And its continued existence in the most unlikely of places is the greatest trick it has ever pulled. It's a quiet, defiant statement that even in our modern sterile world, there is still room for a little bit of wild, mischievous magic. You just have to know where to look.